Hi, this is Matt McCormick. I'm in the Department of Philosophy at California State University, Sacramento. This is my second lecture on Eliminative Materialism for my Philosophy of Mind course going up on my YouTube channel. So we have seen some of the background from the history of science that led eliminative materialists to express at the very least caution about the boards we're standing on when we launch into a scientific inquiry into the nature of some phenomena. So what the EM theorists are worried about is that the ideas that got us started, that led us into the question about what is the nature of mind, themselves are outdated, misguided, ill-framed, not reflecting of modern scientific and neuroscientific inquiries and evidence about the nature of the brain and the human nervous system. So the idea behind eliminative materialism is that we either need to be prepared to revise our terms in the light of new empirical discoveries about the nature of the mind, or in some cases we should just scrap the conceptual framework that got us here altogether because it doesn't fit the way we scrapped evil demon possession as a kind of explanation for medical problems from the Middle Ages. Okay, so the name for this theory, for this position that they propose that we scrap, is folk psychology. In our ordinary discussions of minds, we have concepts like pain, desire, hunger, beliefs, goal, intention, sadness, and so on. We use all of these terms. We think of them as being meaningful. We think of them as carving up something real in the world and something that needs to have a theory about it, something that needs to be explained. Furthermore, folk psychology is a sort of theory maintained, the eliminative materialists. It has principles. It has theorems in it. In general, for instance, this is implicit in the way we talk to each other, the way we think about each other, but the idea is that it has principles like this. In general, when someone's sad, they will have X, Y, and Z beliefs. And A, B, and C tendencies. There's certain sorts of behaviors or certain sorts of beliefs that we expect to be the consequences of sadness, and others that we don't. And that's sort of the theory that we operate on when we're navigating a world full of other human beings. So when someone is in pain, they will do T or U or V. The concepts and principles all put together then, not just about pain, but about everything we describe about ourselves, our minds, they form a folk theory about mental states. And again, it's a folk theory because it's our common sense theory. It's the way we all talk around the dinner table about each other. It's not built from, you know, a quantum particle lab or from a particle accelerator or from a behavioral psychology lab. It didn't come out of there. It came out of common sense, what we learned from our parents, our families, from our churches, from people that were around, just our ordinary folk way of talking to each other. Okay, so there's lots of other examples of folk theories. Folk physics, for instance. So many people have gravely mistaken ideas about the trajectories of falling or launched objects, for example. They're bad judges of distance, especially of heights. And the idea here is that, look, there's always folk theories about all kinds of things, including physics. And one thing they're going to argue is that there's a good inductive argument against folk psychology, that in general, when we draw one of these folk theories from the past, from culture, it has little to do with the reality of what's actually going on. One example here is in this case, the circular tube on the bottom left. If you launch a ball through the curved tube, what will the ball do when it comes out the other side? And a surprising number of people, when you give them this example, think that the ball will come out and curve when it comes out of the curved tube. Despite having, you know, an abundant amount of physical evidence to the contrary from their own experience. The folk physical theory that operates in lots of people's heads is not informed by even their own empirical experience of the things they see on a daily basis. And lots of these others, you're going to be very familiar with them. Folk medicine is a big one. You know, your grandma says you need to take a teaspoon of honey for a cough. She's actually not wrong about that. A lot of people, a lot of Americans believe that anger or stress cause cancer. They're wrong about that. There's a lot of people who believe that your muscles accumulate environmental toxins that need to be cleansed with exotic food regimens and rituals, none of which is true. Acupuncture aligns your energy meridians. That's a folk medical theory that's gotten sort of widespread acceptance. My doctor at Kaiser recommended that I get acupuncture the other day, and I jumped on his case about the empirical evidence for it. And Libras, of course, from your astrology forecast, they're feisty, and you shouldn't date them. You should be careful about hanging around with them, right? So we've got these folk theories. Most of these are dead wrong, have nothing to do, they don't track on reality. I mean, here's a good example, right? I'll pick on astrology. There's lots of people who feel like knowing somebody's astrological sign gives them some powerful predictive information about their behavior. Oh, you're a good person to hang out with. You're not a good person. You've got bad energy. You're not a good person for me to be with. Or I should avoid, Libras on this day and Sagittarius is on this other day, and sort of following along with an astrology app or something on your phone that's giving you all this advice that's claiming to make sort of predictive, accurate claims about the interaction of humans in the world. It's a folk theory, and it tracks back for thousands of years, and it's just flat dead wrong. It doesn't track on any real phenomena. It doesn't have any predictive success. What's happening there is mostly a case of confirmation bias. That once you've got this idea in your head that Libras are feisty, you find examples that corroborate it. Or once you've got this idea that you shouldn't date Sagittarius, you pull out all these examples of the last time you dated one and how badly it went, and that's your evidence, right? So it's cherry picking of evidence that supports it. So what then is folk psychology a theory of? And the question we're asking is, will the concepts and principles of folk psychology be like demon theory was an explanation of disease in the Middle Ages, or will it be like heat? We have retained the concept of heat, like we've retained the concept of atoms, but we've revised the definitions and the theory around them considerably. So are we going to hold on to the terms and redefine as we get more information, or are we going to jettison the whole idea because it's just too, folk psychology, because it's just too bankrupt to give us any predictive power? So there's actually a range of views here amongst eliminative materialists. Some of them, some EM positions are ontologically conservative when they retain the entities of the old theory and realign them to the new theory. So that's like my example from the ancient Greeks, use of the word atom. So we've been ontologically conservative about retaining the use of the word atom. It's just that we've redefined everything around it. We still talk about it, but atoms can be split now, and they figure into a very different description of the world than they did originally. Whereas EM positions are ontologically radical when they just scrap the old entities altogether. So that's like the demon case. There's just nothing salvageable about demon theory as an explanation of viral or bacterial infection. So we don't, you don't look up different kinds of demon possession in a modern psychiatric textbook or a modern, virology textbook. Okay, so eliminativists, then they eliminate. We've got lots of examples of them, and now you can identify or sort of categorize some of these. Reductive materialists are eliminativists about the immaterial soul. They don't think there is such a thing. Hard determinists that we ran into last lecture are eliminativists with regard to free will. They think there's no such thing as free will. Hume was arguably an eliminativist about our ordinary notion of the self. He thought there was no such thing. We started with this idea, and then by the time he gets in with his arguments, he thinks there's nothing there. Paul Churchland, famous contemporary philosopher of mind, is an eliminativist about belief as propositional attitude, and that's one of the main EM positions that we're sort of describing in this lecture and last lecture. Daniel Dennett, you'll see, is an eliminativist about qualia, and we'll be looking at that argument and that article in a few weeks in the course. Okay, so on radical eliminative materialism, mental terms and principles will do what? They will turn out to be empty, with mental state terms referring to nothing that actually exists. There just won't be a thing there like an evil demon that we can hang the term on. Or the conceptual framework provided by the neurosciences or some other physical account can or should come to replace the common sense framework we now use. So that'll all get supplanted as we learn more about how human brains work. Here's another sort of comment you'll hear in the lecture, in the literature, in a way that people talk about EM. They say it's a theory. And what they mean is, according to the eliminative materialists, they say we employ a theoretical framework to explain and predict human intelligent behavior. That is, they're calling out folk psychology as a theory. They have a theory that we use a theory. So they have a theory. And they're sort of the first to think of our folk psychological terms in terms of a theory, to describe it as a theory, and therefore subject to revision, change, alteration, empirical investigation, and so on. So eliminative materialism has a theory. It has a theory that folk psychology is a theory. That's their position. And that's subject to refutation or to consideration or analysis too. Okay, so folk psychology then consists of both generalizations or laws and specific theoretical posits denoted by our everyday psychological terms like belief or pain. The generalizations are assumed to describe the various causal or counterfactual relations and regularities of the posits. That's what's happening when I'm predicting your behavior when I say you're sad. Oh, he's sad, he's going to go eat a pint of Ben & Jerry's. For instance, a typical example of a folk psychological generalization would be something like, if someone has the desire for X and the belief that the best way to get X is by doing Y, then, barring certain conditions, that person will tend to do Y. And that's a theory with a principle that invokes desire and belief as these entities, and then it connects them up and describes how they have predictive power. On the theory, mental states are nothing but the posits of folk psychology. There's nothing else there except just this sort of fictitious demon stories we tell ourselves. These theoretical posits, like beliefs, pains, and tensions, are not directly observed because they're inside the head, though they are thought to account for the observable effects like overt behavior. So, the facial expression of sadness and the eating of the pint of Ben & Jerry's are the outwardly manifest overt behavior, and it's the thoughts, the desires, the emotional states, the beliefs that I attribute that are inside the head that have this economy that lead to the output states. Theory theorists also claim that common sense assigns a number of properties to these states, such as causal, semantic, and qualitative features. And you remember that from the language of thoughts discussion with Fodor and Chomsky. There are these entities, according to the theory, and the entities cause things to happen. A belief in the head causes you to go do something. They interact with other entities, they generate behavior, and so on. Okay, so what are the arguments for eliminative materialism, at least the ones we covered? Well, one of the arguments for eliminative materialism, that is for getting rid of folk psychology, is that when we evaluate folk psychology on the basis of its predictive power and its explanatory success, it just doesn't do a very good job, a little bit like astrology. It works for our ordinary cases, like Newtonian physics works, in sort of ordinary high school physics classrooms. But advanced research into behavior and cognitive states make it break down. When you start looking at really detailed empirical psychology that's teasing out these subtle differences in behaviors, it doesn't seem to work out anymore that we can just use the same terms, the entities, the concepts, the principles that we use around the dinner table when we're just talking casually about each other. Folk psychology either excludes or is mistaken about important mental phenomena like dreaming, consciousness, mental disorders, learning processes, and memory. All of those things are getting, informed by, and our view of them are getting revised by the neuroscience and empirical psychology. And the things we had to say with our folk theory just don't sort of frame, they don't fit, they don't work anymore. Whereas neuroscience, by contrast to this lack of development, because folk psychology is not going anywhere, is a rapidly progressing science that can explain many cognitive processes that folk psychology cannot. And we're going to see some of these sort of subtle, weird, interesting problems come out as we look at some more of these theories later in the semester. Folk psychology retains obsolete theories, legends, and concepts from the past. That's a reason to get rid of it. Just like we used to personify natural mysteries. We used to say the sea is angry, but then we replaced that explanation with a physical one, and we can do the same for the brain. The way we talk about the mind needs to be updated. Beliefs, intentions, thoughts are just as mythological, according to the eliminative materialist. Like dualists, eliminative materialists insist that ordinary mental states cannot in any way be reduced or identified with neurological events or processes. However, unlike dualists, eliminativists claim there is nothing more to the mind than what occurs in the brain. It's just all about the brain. The reason mental states are irreducible is not because they are non-physical, rather it's because these mental states, the ones described by common sense psychology, don't really exist. They're not reducible in the same way demons aren't reducible. You can't capture them by a theory either, because there's no such thing. That the conceptual framework that we're using to try to explain pathology or explain sickness with a demon theory just doesn't frame onto or match with the empirical data. So folk psychology, here's another argument that they present. They say it's doomed by an inductive argument. Other folk theories like folk biology, folk physics, and folk cosmology have turned out to be radically wrong. So you get this argument. Most folk theories are wrong. Folk psychology is a folk theory. Therefore, folk psychology will turn out to be probably wrong. Why would we think that the concepts, the entities, the terms, the principles that we've been using for thousands of years in human culture, why would we think that those would track on the actual real state of the physical, cognitive, neuroprocessing system inside the brain? Ideas or concepts that were invoked in Iron Age context to explain, human behavior at in the most crude terms need to be updated to the sort of contemporary information. Okay, so I'll consider a few objections and the responses to it. One objection that's come out in the literature is this comment. People say, oh, well, there's something self-refuting about eliminative materialism because they seem to believe that there are no beliefs, that itself is contradictory. A capacity or an activity that is somehow invoked by the eliminativist is itself something that requires the existence of beliefs. So the idea here is that the eliminative materialist is asserting something to be true, and they're claiming this to be true about the world. That is, they believe that there's no such thing as beliefs, and that by itself is sort of strange, awkward, self-refuting, or sort of bizarre, right? That they're implicitly assuming or adopting the very things that they're claiming aren't real. For the irony of somebody saying, well, I don't believe in beliefs. Wait a minute, you said you don't believe in beliefs. You have a different belief? That itself shows that you must be mistaken. Hence, for eliminative materialism to be asserted as a thesis, the eliminativist herself must believe that it's true. At least so goes the objection. Eliminative materialists, I think, are not particularly troubled by this. They're happy to say something like, well, it's fine to sort of invoke or use common sense folk psychological language in our ordinary discussions if we want. Sometimes it's useful, sometimes it's fine for those contexts. We still say things like the sun rises. Even an astronomer says something like, well, the sun rose this morning, or I was up at sunrise. Well, the sun doesn't rise, the earth turns. But we still talk that way because it's convenient, because we all understand what we mean by it, and we know that were we to press or to dig deeper, that something else is actually the case. So I think the eliminative materialist who gets this self-refutation objection might just brush it off in a similar way. But if the eliminativist has such a belief, then there are beliefs, and the eliminativist or eliminativism is thereby proven false. Eliminative materialism is in some sense self-refuting. So goes the objection. Okay, so now to summarize all the views then, eliminative materialism concludes that the concepts, principles, and entities of folk psychology need to be revised. That's the conservative approach, or just eliminated altogether, because folk theories are usually wrong. They're bad theories based on ancient presumptions. And we've considered this objection that eliminative materialism is self-refuting. They believe that there are no beliefs. And I've suggested that the eliminative materialists are just going to go respond and say, look, belief talk is fine. It's a casual way of talking about the subject matter. But when we're going to get serious and we're actually going to analyze what minds are, we're going to dig in and throw out a lot of these terms. We're going to need a new scaffolding, a new conceptual scaffolding to talk about what we're discovering with neuroscience. They're not true, strictly speaking, but they're useful in some contexts. Okay, so that's the end of my second eliminative materialism lecture. We'll be moving on according to the schedule for the next week.